On my 72nd birthday, a lawyer called me. Your first husband from 1992 died and left you 88 million. My current husband was standing next to me and heard every word. I nodded and hung up. What he did the next morning? Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Calloway, and I turned 72 on a Tuesday in October. Not a milestone birthday. 70 was the milestone, the one with the party and the grandchildren flying in from Portland and Denver. 72 was supposed to be quiet. A dinner at home, Donald's pot roast, maybe a glass of the Bordeaux we'd been saving. That was the plan. Donald and I had been married for 11 years. We met at a grief support group. His wife had passed from cancer, my second husband from a sudden heart attack. And what started as two tired people sharing bad coffee in a church basement became, over time, something I had genuinely learned to trust. He was methodical, careful with money, a retired civil engineer from Columbus who clipped coupons and kept a spreadsheet for household expenses. Romantic? No, but solid. I had believed in solid. We lived in the house I owned outright in Westerville, Ohio, a 4-bedroom colonial I'd bought with my own savings after my second divorce, long before Donald ever entered the picture. I want that detail to be perfectly clear because it matters enormously to everything that followed. The first warning sign came about 6 months before my birthday. I noticed it the way you notice a draft. Not all at once, but gradually, until you can't ignore it anymore. Donald had started asking questions about my finances. Not aggressively, not obviously. He'd slip them into ordinary conversation. Did you ever sort out that old IRA your accountant mentioned? And, you should really think about updating your will, Margaret. At our age, it's irresponsible not to. His tone was always reasonable. That was the thing. The tone was always so completely reasonable. Then, in August, I found a browser tab he'd left open on the shared laptop. It was a legal forum thread with a title that made my stomach drop. Spousal Rights to Inheritance Received During Marriage, Ohio Law. I closed it without saying anything. I told myself there was an innocent explanation. I told myself a lot of things that summer that I no longer believe. His daughter Cheryl had also become more present. Cheryl was 44, twice divorced herself, living in a rental in Dayton with what I understood to be significant credit card debt. She started calling her father every Sunday, which was new, and twice she drove up unannounced for dinner. Each time, she was warm to me in a way that felt performed. The kind of warm that puts its arm around your shoulder and quietly checks the label on your coat. I didn't connect all of this into a single picture. Not yet. People are slow to see what they don't want to see. I was no different. And then came my birthday. We were standing in the kitchen after dinner. Donald was rinsing the plates and I was wiping down the counter. The Bordeaux was open. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and wood smoke from the fireplace in the next room. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought, this is fine. This is a good life. My phone rang, an Ohio area code I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Gerald Fitch, an attorney in Cincinnati. He spoke in the measured, almost apologetic tone that lawyers use when delivering unexpected news. He said he was handling the estate of Robert Harmon, my first husband, Robert, from a marriage that had lasted 4 years in the early 1990s and ended without bitterness. Just two young people who had wanted different things. Robert, he said, had died 3 weeks earlier of a stroke. He had never remarried. He had built a commercial real estate business in Cincinnati over 30 years, and he had left me $88 million. I stood completely still. The dishwater was still running. I was aware of every sound in that kitchen. The creak of the floorboard under Donald's left foot, the tick of the clock above the stove, the faint hiss of the fire. I said, I understand. Thank you for calling, Mr. Fitch. I'll be in touch. I hung up. I turned back to the counter and kept wiping it down. Donald turned off the faucet. He dried his hands slowly on the dish towel. He did not look at me directly. He looked at the middle distance, the way people do when they are reorganizing their thoughts very quickly. "Good news?" he said. "Old friend," I said. "Passing on." He nodded. He folded the dish towel. He said he was going to watch the news and left the room. I stood in the kitchen alone for a long time after that. The Bordeaux sat on the counter, barely touched. Outside, the October wind moved through the oak tree in the backyard. That great old tree that had been there since before I bought the house. Before any of this. Before any of them. I had heard every word of that conversation, and so had he. I knew it. He knew I knew it. And in that moment, everything I thought I understood about my life shifted, quietly and completely, like furniture rearranged in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my side of the bed, listening to Donald breathe, that slow, even rhythm that used to comfort me. And I thought about Robert Harmon. I thought about who he had been at 26. That serious young man who read architectural history for fun and made French press coffee at 6 in the morning. I thought about how we had parted. No lawyers, no fights, just a mutual agreement that we wanted different futures. I had wished him well and meant it. I had not thought about him in years. And now, from 30 years of silence, he had reached back and changed everything. By 3 in the morning, I had stopped thinking about Robert and started thinking about Donald. I ran through it carefully, the way you do when you don't want to be wrong but suspect you already are. The browser tab. Cheryl's sudden warmth. The questions about the IRA, the will. 11 years of marriage, and in all that time, Donald had never once asked about my estate planning, and then, starting 6 months ago, he had asked about it repeatedly. Was I being paranoid? I examined that possibility with genuine fairness. I am, by nature, a practical woman. I spent 30 years as a hospital administrator, which means I have a professional relationship with worst-case scenarios and how to manage them. Paranoia, in my experience, usually involves seeing patterns that aren't there. What I was seeing was a pattern that was entirely, uncomfortably there. What frightened me most was not the greed. Greed is ordinary. It is almost boring in its predictability. What frightened me was the patience. If Donald had been planning this, or something like this, he had been planning it quietly for months, possibly longer. That kind of patience requires a cold center, and I had been sleeping next to that cold center for 11 years. In the morning, Donald came downstairs and made breakfast as usual. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, half a grapefruit. He put the newspaper by my coffee cup. He asked if I had slept well. I said I had, a little restlessly. He nodded sympathetically and said, "It's the season change. Your body's adjusting." I watched him butter his toast and thought, "How long have you been waiting?" I said nothing. I smiled and drank my coffee. And I began to think. The first thing I needed was information. Specifically, I needed to understand exactly what my legal exposure was, what rights a spouse had, under Ohio law, to an inheritance received during a marriage. I needed to know this before I spoke to Gerald Fitch again, and before I made a single visible move. I could not use the shared computer. I drove to the public library in Westerville that afternoon, telling Donald I had a hair appointment. I sat at a library terminal for 2 hours and read everything I could find about Ohio inheritance law, marital property, and spousal rights. What I found was both reassuring and clarifying. In Ohio, an inheritance received by one spouse, even during a marriage, is generally considered separate property, not marital property, provided it is kept separate and not commingled with joint accounts. The word commingled lodged itself in my brain. If I deposited $88 million into a joint account, or used it to pay for shared expenses, or even mixed it with funds that Donald had access to, the lines could blur. In a divorce proceeding, a skilled attorney could argue. And Donald, I now understood, had almost certainly been reading about exactly this. That afternoon, I called my daughter Claire from my cell phone while sitting in the library parking lot. Claire is 43 and lives in Columbus, 20 minutes from me. She is not the type to panic. I told her I had received some unexpected news about an inheritance and that I needed her help with something, but that I couldn't explain everything yet. She said, "Mom, are you safe?" I said yes. She said, "When do you need me?" I said, "Sunday." The plan forming in my mind was simple in outline and careful in execution. First, retain my own attorney, someone Donald had never heard of and had no connection to, before I responded officially to Gerald Fitch. Second, open a new bank account in my name only at a bank I had never used jointly with Donald. Third, begin quietly gathering documentation, financial records, the deed to the house, anything that established what was mine before this marriage and what would remain mine after it. I was not planning a divorce, not yet. I was planning something more preliminary than that. I was planning to protect myself on the possibility that the man in my kitchen was not who I had believed him to be. It was the most sensible thing I had done in years, and it was the beginning of everything. The following Monday, I drove to Dublin, Ohio, far enough from Westerville that I was unlikely to run into anyone Donald knew. And I walked into the office of a family law attorney named Patricia Nguyen. I had found her through the State Bar Referral Service, specifically filtering for attorneys who had no affiliation with any firm Donald's company had ever used. I am meticulous by habit. 30 years of hospital administration teaches you that the details you overlook are the ones that hurt you. Patricia was 51, direct, and mercifully free of the performed sympathy that some attorneys deploy when they sense a large estate. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. The first was, "Is the inheritance documented in writing from the estate's attorney?" The second was, "Has your husband indicated explicitly or implicitly that he is aware of the inheritance?" I answered yes to both. She told me what I needed to hear, which was not necessarily what I wanted to hear. The inheritance, as an Ohio separate property asset, was protectable, but only if I acted carefully and promptly. She recommended the same steps I had already identified: a separate account, no commingling, documentation of all premarital assets. She also recommended something I hadn't considered: a quiet review of any changes Donald might have made to any joint financial instruments in the past 6 months. That last point stopped me cold. When I got home that afternoon, Donald was in the garage, reorganizing his tools. Something he did when he was restless, I had long observed. I told him I'd had lunch with an old colleague from the hospital. He asked how she was doing. I said fine. That evening, while he watched television, I went through the filing cabinet in the home office. I was looking for the folder marked Joint Accounts, Correspondence. I had last looked at it perhaps 2 years ago. What I found stopped my breath. There was a letter dated 8 weeks earlier from our joint investment account at Merrill Lynch. It was a confirmation of a beneficiary designation change. Donald had named Cheryl, his daughter, as the sole secondary beneficiary on the joint investment account, removing the designation we had agreed on together years ago, which had split secondary beneficiary rights between Claire and Cheryl equally. He had changed it without telling me, without asking me. I stood in the home office for a long moment, holding the letter. The television murmured from the next room. A news program, the familiar cadence of it, completely normal and utterly surreal. This was not a smoking gun. A beneficiary change was, technically, within his rights on a joint account. I would need Patricia to confirm the specifics, but it was something far more important than a legal instrument. It was evidence of intention. It was proof that, in the weeks between my birthday phone call and today, Donald had been making quiet, deliberate financial moves. Or, and this was the thought that made my hands go cold, he had made this change 8 weeks ago, before my birthday, which meant he had been planning for some version of this scenario before he even knew about the inheritance. I photographed the letter with my phone. I put it back exactly as I found it. I returned to the living room and sat down next to Donald on the sofa, and I watched 40 minutes of news without retaining a single word of it. Meanwhile, I understood later, the dynamic in the house had already shifted in ways I couldn't see. Donald was watchful. I was not, by nature, a secretive woman, and my sudden afternoon errands and quiet evenings in the home office were things he noticed, I'm sure of it. He said nothing. But Cheryl called twice that week, which was unusual even by recent standards, once on Wednesday evening, once on Friday afternoon. Both times, Donald took the call in the garage. I did not know then what they were saying. I would find out later. But I knew instinctively, the way you know a storm is coming not from the clouds, but from the way the air changes, that they were comparing notes. Calculating. I called Patricia that Friday night and described what I had found. There was a pause on her end, and then she said, in the careful tone of someone choosing words with precision, "Margaret, I think we need to move more quickly than I originally suggested." I agreed. The point of no return, I have since understood, is rarely a single dramatic moment. More often it is a letter in a filing cabinet, a phone call taken in a garage, and the quiet recognition that you are not, and perhaps never were, entirely safe in your own home. By the end of October, I had done everything Patricia advised. I opened a new checking account at a regional bank in Dublin, in my name alone. I contacted Gerald Fitch and formally acknowledged the inheritance, providing Patricia's contact information for all subsequent legal communication. Patricia, in turn, filed the appropriate documentation establishing the inheritance as separate property under Ohio law, with a clear paper trail beginning on day 1. I had the deed to the house reviewed and confirmed as solely in my name, a fact I had simply never thought to use as a weapon before, but which now felt like a foundation. I had also, quietly and without drama, consulted a financial advisor at a firm Patricia recommended and begun the process of establishing a trust structure that would protect the inheritance from any future marital claim. I felt, for the first time since that Tuesday night in October, like I was standing on solid ground. It lasted exactly 4 days. On a Thursday morning, while I was reading on the back porch with my second cup of coffee, Donald came outside and sat down across from me. He did not have coffee. He did not have the newspaper. He had the look of a man who had prepared what he was about to say. "I know you've been to see an attorney," he said, "a Patricia Nguyen in Dublin." I kept my face still. "What makes you say that?" "Because Cheryl knows someone who works in that building." He paused. "Margaret, I'm not angry. I'm hurt. After 11 years, the fact that you would go to a lawyer without telling me." He stopped. His voice had the precise calibration of a man performing disappointment. "I just want to understand what you're afraid of." I looked at him across the porch table. This man I had shared a bed with for over a decade. And I thought about the beneficiary letter, about the browser tab, about Cheryl's Sunday phone calls. And I said calmly, "I'm protecting my assets, Donald. That seems reasonable." His face changed then, just slightly. The performed hurt fell away, replaced by something harder. "That money," he said, "came into this marriage. What comes into a marriage belongs to the marriage. I'd suggest you speak to a different attorney before you do something you'll regret." "Are you threatening me?" I asked. "I'm advising you," he said. "There's a difference." He went back inside. That afternoon, Cheryl called my personal cell phone, a number I had never given her, which meant Donald had provided it. She was friendly, almost cheerful, which was worse than hostility. She said she hoped there was no misunderstanding, that she and her father both cared about me deeply, and that she hoped I'd spoken to my doctor recently about stress management. "Sometimes, at a certain age," she said, with an almost imperceptible pause, "people make decisions that don't serve them well." It was, I recognized, a soft threat, the implication that I might be confused, perhaps not fully competent. I had spent 30 years in hospital administration. I knew exactly what that implication was designed to do. "Cheryl," I said, "I appreciate your concern. I'll be in touch." I hung up. I called Patricia from my car in the library parking lot. I had taken to using that location as a private phone booth, and told her what had happened. She was not surprised. She told me to document both conversations with dates and exact wording while they were fresh. She also told me something that steadied me. They're worried. People who are confident don't threaten. They warn you because they're losing. That helped, but it didn't make the drive home any easier. What they had done was show their hand, and the hand was uglier than I'd wanted to believe. I gave myself the weekend. I drove to Claire's house in Columbus on Saturday morning, told her everything, and sat at her kitchen table while she made soup and didn't cry, which I was grateful for. I needed steadiness, not sympathy. Claire provided it. I stayed 2 nights, and I slept, for the first time in weeks, without lying awake cataloging risks. By Sunday evening, I was back in Westerville, in my house, in the kitchen that smelled like wood smoke. Donald and I ate dinner in near silence. He asked if I'd had a good visit with Claire. I said I had. I was not afraid of him anymore. I was, in some way I could not fully articulate, grateful for what he had done. Because threatening someone who already suspects you is not strategy. It is confirmation. November in Westerville is the color of pewter. The oak tree in the backyard had given up its last leaves, and the neighborhood settled into that quiet that comes when the year starts folding inward. I had always liked November. It suited a certain kind of thinking. Donald had, since Thursday's confrontation, adopted a new strategy. He was being kind, not the ordinary, habitual kindness of a long marriage, the reflexive courtesies that you stop noticing, but a deliberate, curated kindness. He brought me coffee in the morning without my asking. He suggested we have dinner at Rigsby's Kitchen, which had been a favorite of mine years ago, and which we hadn't visited in at least 2 years. He mentioned, gently, that he'd been thinking about a trip to Portugal. Something we've always talked about. He was, in the language of what I now understood this situation to be, making an offer. The offer was, stand down, return to what we were. Let this go. I will be good to you. I found it interesting. Not tempting. Interesting. There is a difference, and the difference matters. I understood what he was doing, and I understood why it wouldn't work. Because the beneficiary change predated the inheritance. Whatever version of me Donald was now performing kindness for, he had been quietly arranging things before he even knew there was $88 million at stake. That meant this was not opportunism triggered by the phone call. This was something older and more deliberate. A man who changes a beneficiary designation and reads about spousal inheritance rights is a man who has been calculating his position for some time. I accepted the dinner at Rigsby's. I ordered the duck. I was pleasant, present, and gave him nothing. On the drive home, he reached across and put his hand over mine on the armrest. I let him. I looked out the passenger window at the dark streets of Columbus and thought about how strange it is, how genuinely strange, to sit beside someone who no longer exists for you in the way they once did. Cheryl, for her part, had gone quiet. No calls that week, no unannounced visits. I had the distinct feeling of being observed from a distance, the way wildlife researchers watch from a blind, present, patient, waiting to see what the subject does next. I did the following. I reached out to a woman named Dolores Whitman, Dr. Dolores Whitman, who had been my closest colleague for 14 years at the hospital and who had retired 2 years before I did. Dolores was 70, sharp as a tack, and had navigated her own divorce from a man with complicated finances in her 50s. I called her and, over 2 long phone calls, told her everything. Dolores did not say, "I'm so sorry," or "How could he?" She said, "All right, what do you need?" That was why I had called her. What I needed, it turned out, was a witness. Not in any legal sense. I had Patricia for that. I needed someone who would remember that I was clear-minded, deliberate, and in full possession of my faculties. I needed someone who could, if it ever became necessary, testify to my character and my competence. Cheryl's comment about decisions that don't serve people well had stayed with me. It was too specific to be casual. The possibility that they might try to challenge my competence, to paint me as a confused old woman making poor decisions, was one I needed to foreclose. I also called my doctor, James Keller, and made an appointment for a full checkup, including a brief cognitive screening. This was something I had done regularly for years, but this time I specifically asked that it be documented thoroughly. James, who had known me for 15 years, raised an eyebrow and asked if everything was all right. I told him I just wanted a thorough record. He nodded, and I could see he understood more than I'd said. Building a record. That was what November was, in the end. A quiet month of building a record. Donald watched. Brought coffee. Suggested Portugal. Waited. I was courteous, measured, and, beneath all of it, moved by the clarity that comes when you stop being afraid of losing something you've already lost. My marriage, whatever it had been, was over. I didn't grieve it exactly. I grieved the idea of it. The version of Donald I had believed in for 11 years. That man, I understood now, had either never existed or had been carefully maintained for purposes I was only now beginning to fully see. What I had in exchange for that grief was something I hadn't expected. I had myself, completely, without apology. That, it turned out, was enough. They came on a Saturday. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard Donald's car in the driveway, followed by a second car, Cheryl's. I had not been told she was coming. I stood at the counter and took a slow breath. Then I put on water for a second cup. They came in through the back door as they always had, and Cheryl was already talking before she'd fully stepped inside. Warm, cheerful, a bottle of wine in her hand. The entire performance assembled and running. She said she'd been thinking about me all week. She said she felt terrible about how things had been lately. She said, and this was the line I had been waiting for, in one form or another, that she hoped we could all start fresh. I invited them to sit. I poured tea. I listened. What followed was approximately 40 minutes of the most carefully constructed manipulation I have ever witnessed at close range. And I want to say that as a professional compliment, in the way one might acknowledge a technically proficient but ultimately losing chess game. Donald spoke first, in the register of a reasonable man seeking resolution. He said he had spoken to his own attorney. He named the firm, a large one in Columbus, which I recognized, and that his attorney had advised him that the inheritance question was genuinely complex, that commingling had arguably already occurred given our joint household expenses, and that a protracted legal dispute would be costly, time-consuming, and damaging to both of us. He was not wrong on the technical point. This was the sophistication of the approach. It was not entirely false. An aggressive attorney could argue commingling. It would be an uphill argument, but it could be made. He was offering me a way out that was dressed as a warning. Stand down. Return to what we were. Let this go. I will be good to you. Then Cheryl opened a folder she had brought. An actual folder, which told me how seriously they had prepared for this visit. Inside were printouts of Ohio marital property statutes, highlighted in yellow. She slid them across the table toward me as if presenting evidence, her tone patient and instructional. The way someone speaks to a person they have already decided is confused. She said she'd done her own research and that she just wanted me to have the full picture before I made any decisions I couldn't undo. That was the moment I understood the depth of what they were willing to do. This was not improvised. This had been planned. The folder, the highlighted statutes, the coordinated script. They had sat down together, possibly with Albright's input, and prepared a presentation. For me, in my own kitchen, Cheryl came in on cue. She talked about family. She talked about what a long fight would do to our relationship with Claire. She mentioned Claire specifically, which told me they had been thinking about pressure points. She said she loved her father, and she loved me, and that she couldn't stand watching two people she cared about hurt each other. And then she said, "Margaret, you've had a shock. Anyone would be disoriented. All we're asking is that you take some time and think carefully before you let an attorney make decisions for you." Disoriented. There it was. I looked at Cheryl. She was 44 years old with a friendly face and careful eyes, and she had just called me disoriented in my own kitchen in front of a folder full of highlighted statutes she had driven 45 minutes to deliver. I took a sip of my tea. I said, "I had a full physical last week, including cognitive screening. My doctor documented everything. I'm in excellent health, and I'm entirely clear-headed, which is more than I can say for this conversation." The silence that followed was brief but informative. "I have an attorney I trust," I continued. "The inheritance is documented as separate property from day one, and the beneficiary change you made in September, Donald, 8 weeks before my birthday, before any of this, is also documented." Donald's face did something I had not seen it do in 11 years. It went still. Not the stillness of composure, but the stillness of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath him is different from what he thought. "I think what you're both hoping," I said, "is that I'm frightened enough to settle for something I don't owe you. I understand why you thought that might work, but I want you to know, clearly and without any ambiguity, that it won't." Cheryl set down her wine glass. The warmth had gone out of her face completely. What was left was something narrow and cool, and I recognized it for what it was. Not anger, exactly, but recalculation. She was already thinking about the next move. "You're making a mistake," Donald said. "That's the second time you've told me that," I said. "It hasn't become more convincing." They left. Not loudly. There were no raised voices, no doors slammed. Which was, in its way, more unsettling than shouting would have been. They simply gathered themselves and went. And I heard 2 car doors and 2 engines, and then the street was quiet again, the way it always was on a November Saturday in Westerville, when the neighbors were inside and the sky was the color of old pewter. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. I will not pretend I wasn't frightened. I was. Not of them, precisely. I did not believe Donald was a violent man. I was frightened of the machinery they were willing to set in motion: attorneys, arguments, the slow grind of contested proceedings, the possibility of being painted in court documents as an elderly woman who had been manipulated by a predatory estate attorney. Fear is not irrational when the threat is real. But here is what I learned that Saturday. Fear, when you don't give it permission to stop you, has another use entirely. It sharpens you. It reminds you what is at stake. I let myself feel it fully. The cold weight of it, sitting in my chest like a stone. And then I picked up my phone and called Patricia. "They came," I said. I held the line. "Good," she said. "Now let's finish this." The decisive scene did not look the way I had imagined it. I had half expected a courtroom, the formal theater of it, the gavels and objections. What it actually looked like was a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus in early December, with snow falling outside the windows and bad coffee in paper cups on a long table. Patricia had requested a 4-way meeting, herself and me, Donald and his attorney, a man named Greg Albright, who had the look of someone who charged $400 an hour and wanted you to know it. He wore a tie pin. I noticed the tie pin because I noticed everything in that room with unusual clarity, the way the mind sharpens when it knows the situation is consequential. The stated purpose of the meeting was to establish whether the parties could reach a pre-litigation resolution on the question of the Harmon inheritance. In reality, it was something Patricia had prepared for with considerable care. She had spent the preceding 3 weeks building a file, and I had helped her build it, spending evenings at my kitchen table going through records, cross-referencing dates, writing out timelines with the methodical attention to detail that 30 years of hospital administration had made second nature to me. Donald arrived with Albright, and for the first 20 minutes, the conversation proceeded as these conversations do: formal, cautious, each attorney feeling out the other's position. Albright laid out the commingling argument in the polished language of someone who had made it before. Patricia listened, took notes, and waited. Then she opened her folder. The first document she presented was the beneficiary change notification, dated September 14th. A full 6 weeks before my birthday. 6 weeks before the phone call that Donald had overheard in the kitchen. She asked Albright to confirm the date. He looked at it and said that a beneficiary change was entirely routine. "Certainly," Patricia said pleasantly. "What's less routine is the timing, combined with this." She placed a second document on the table, a printout of the browser history from the shared home laptop, which I had photographed on my phone in late October. The Open Legal Forum tab, spousal rights to inheritance received during marriage, Ohio law, was dated, time-stamped, and clearly attributed to the household's shared account. This was accessed in August, Patricia noted, 2 months before the inheritance was announced. Albright looked at Donald. Donald looked at the table. "What this suggests," Patricia continued, "is that Mr. Calloway was researching his potential spousal claims to an anticipated inheritance before that inheritance existed in this household's knowledge, which raises a question about what information he may have had and from what source." There was a pause. Outside the window, the snow was coming down steadily over Columbus, blurring the edges of buildings, muffling the city into a kind of white quiet. In the conference room, no one moved. I watched Donald across the table. He was a man who had been composed through everything, through my confrontation on the porch, through the Saturday visit with the highlighted folder, through every careful conversation we'd had in the kitchen over the past weeks. He had been composed because he believed he was winning, or at worst, playing to a draw. He was not composed now. That's speculative, Albright said, but his voice had lost its $400 an hour certainty. It's documented, Patricia said. Then she placed the third item on the table. I had not known she was going to include this one. She had told me she would hold it as a last resort and had decided to use it. It was a copy of an email from a probate paralegal at Gerald Fitch's office, obtained with Fitch's full cooperation after Patricia had quietly raised the question of whether there had been a leak. The email, sent to an address that had been traced to Cheryl's apartment in Dayton, contained a summary of the inheritance proceedings. It had been sent 11 days before my birthday, 11 days before Gerald Fitch called me. Someone in Fitch's office had told Cheryl. Cheryl had told Donald, and Donald had changed the beneficiary designation. And then they had waited for the call and stood in the kitchen on my birthday and pretended to learn about it for the first time. Standing close enough to hear every word, performing surprise with the practiced ease of people who had been rehearsing the moment for weeks. Donald said quietly, "That's not," and stopped. "Mr. Calloway," Patricia said, in a tone I will remember for the rest of my life, "I don't think you want to finish that sentence." He didn't. Albright asked for a recess. They stepped into the hallway. Through the glass partition, I could see them speaking in low, tense exchanges. Albright's hands moving in the contained gestures of a man delivering unwelcome assessments. Donald standing with his arms at his sides in the posture of someone who has stopped arguing and started absorbing. The composed, patient man I had lived beside for 11 years had, in the span of 40 minutes, become someone I didn't recognize. Or perhaps I was finally seeing him correctly for the first time. I sat at the conference table and drank my bad coffee and looked out at the snow. I was not triumphant. I was not even particularly relieved, not yet. I was simply present, clear-eyed and still, in the way you are when something that has been moving for a long time finally comes to rest. They came back into the room 12 minutes later. Albright placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a draft settlement framework. It offered no claim on the Harmon inheritance. It proposed a structured and equitable dissolution of marital assets. It was, in the language of these things, a surrender. I looked at Patricia. She gave me the smallest of nods. I looked at Donald. He was looking at the table. Outside, the snow was still falling on Columbus. Somewhere in the city, in a building I would never see, the money that Robert Harmon had spent 30 years building waited, entirely mine, entirely untouched. The divorce was finalized in February. Patricia had warned me it would not be simple, and she was right. No dissolution involving a marriage of 11 years and the assets accumulated in it ever is. But it was unambiguous. The Harmon inheritance, established as separate property from the date of receipt, was untouched. Donald's attempt to argue commingling on the basis of household expenses was dismissed. Patricia had anticipated every angle of it and closed each one with documentation. The court found no merit in the claim. Greg Albright, Donald's attorney, attempted one final gambit in the weeks between the conference room and the finalization. He filed a motion suggesting that I had engaged in financial concealment by opening a separate bank account after the inheritance was received. Patricia disposed of this in approximately 2 pages of response, noting that separate property, by definition, is held separately, and that I had opened the account on the advice of legal counsel with the specific intention of establishing the asset's character. The motion was denied. Albright sent no further filings after that. I imagined his client had stopped being able to afford them. Donald received what the marriage entitled him to: a fair division of the assets we had genuinely accumulated together. The joint investment account, the joint savings, a proportional settlement for his contribution to household expenses during our marriage. Nothing more. The beneficiary change he had made in September, the one that had first tipped me off, the one that had started all of this, was reversed by court order, and the account was restructured as part of the final settlement. Cheryl's name was removed from every document that bore it. Cheryl herself received nothing because Cheryl was never, legally speaking, a party to any of this. What she had been was a co-conspirator in a strategy that failed. The paralegal at Gerald Fitch's office who had leaked the inheritance information to her was terminated and faced a civil complaint from the estate. Fitch was appropriately mortified and cooperated fully. The leak had apparently been a favor done for a fee, the details of which I preferred not to dwell on. What mattered was that the trail had been documented thoroughly enough that no one in that arrangement could pretend it hadn't happened. On the last day of the proceedings, I signed the final documents in Patricia's office, in the same Dublin, Ohio building where I had first walked in 2 months earlier, with nothing but a photographed letter and a clear head. It was a gray February morning, the kind that feels provisional, like the city is waiting to decide what season it wants to be. Patricia shook my hand across her desk. She said, "You did everything right." I thanked her. I meant it more than she probably knew. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes before driving home. I did not feel the need to call anyone immediately or to mark the moment with anything ceremonial. What I felt was the specific, practical satisfaction of a thing completed, like the final item checked off a long list, the kind you've been carrying for so long you've stopped noticing the weight until the moment it's gone. I drove home through a February afternoon that was gray and cold and completely ordinary, and I sat in my kitchen, in my house, in the colonial I had bought with my own money long before any of this. And I made myself a cup of tea. I added honey, which I didn't usually do. It felt like the right occasion for honey. The oak tree in the backyard stood bare against the white sky. I had always liked that tree. I liked it more than ever now. It had been there before Donald, before Robert's money, before any of the fear and calculation and careful maneuvering of the past months. It would be there after all of it, too, going through its seasons without anyone's permission. There is a particular freedom that comes from a thing being finished. Not resolved, not healed, but finished. The marriage was over. The threat was neutralized. The money was mine and the house was mine, and the life ahead of me was, for the first time in some years, mine in a way it had not fully been. I thought about Donald briefly, not with anger. Anger had been useful when I needed it, and I had no further use for it now. I thought about the man I had believed him to be for 11 years, and whether that man had ever existed. I had come to think that he had, partially. The grief support group had been genuine. The early years of the marriage had been genuine. Somewhere along the line, something had shifted. An opportunity perceived, an appetite discovered, a slow accumulation of a different kind of intention. People make calculations. It is ordinary and human to do so. What is less ordinary is to make those calculations with such patience and cold deliberateness for so long in the bed of someone who trusted you. I did not pity him. I simply moved on. What I did feel, strongly and without apology, was gratitude toward Robert Harmon. Not because of the money, though the money was real and its security was real. But because his final gift had arrived at precisely the moment I needed it to arrive. Not as a windfall, but as a test of what I was made of whether I would see clearly, act carefully, and refuse to be managed. I had passed the test. I would be the first to admit I needed help to pass it. Patricia's counsel, Dolores's steadiness, Claire's soup, and 2 nights of solid sleep. Nobody does anything entirely alone. But the clarity, the decision to act from the very first morning, the refusal to be frightened into surrender, that had been my own. I called Gerald Fitch's office the following week and confirmed the formal acceptance of the inheritance. I had already, on Patricia's advice, established the trust structure. The money settled into it cleanly, completely separate, entirely protected. $88 million. Robert Harmon had built it quietly, over 30 years, the way he had done everything, carefully, without fanfare, one careful decision at a time. It seemed right that it should come to someone who would treat it the same way. I intended to. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the oak tree had its first buds, and I had repainted the front porch, a soft sage green that I had been meaning to do for 2 years, and that Donald had, in his methodical way, always found reasons to postpone. I did it on a Tuesday afternoon with a brush and an old shirt and the radio on, and it was one of the happiest days I'd had in years. I am not a woman who needs grandiosity. I want to be clear about that. I did not buy a yacht or a second home in Tuscany, though Dolores suggested both with the cheerful extravagance of a woman who enjoys suggestions more than their execution. What I did, in the months following the divorce, was make a series of quiet, deliberate choices. The kind that don't photograph well, but that constitute an actual life. I established a charitable foundation in Robert's name, focused on affordable housing in Cincinnati, which had been his city and his business, and I discovered through Gerald Fitch, a cause he had quietly supported for years. The irony that his money, which had almost been taken from me in the service of other people's greed, would instead serve the purpose he'd intended for it, gave me a satisfaction I found difficult to put into words. I paid off Claire's mortgage. She cried. I told her not to be dramatic and then cried a little myself over the phone. I traveled. Not lavishly, not endlessly, but purposefully. I went to Portugal, which Donald had suggested as a bargaining chip, and which I now claimed for myself, walking the streets of Lisbon in October with Dolores, who was excellent company and a tremendous complainer about cobblestones, which made everything funnier. I went to New Mexico the following spring to see the desert in bloom, which I had wanted to do since I was 40 and had never gotten to. I came home restored in a way I hadn't expected. I remained in my house. I liked my house. I added a sunroom onto the back, overlooking the oak tree, and I spent my mornings there with coffee and the newspaper, and, increasingly, an extraordinarily opinionated orange cat named Gerald, named, somewhat unfairly, after the attorney who had brought this whole thing into my life, and who I suspected would find it funny. Dolores and I had dinner every Thursday. Claire and her family came for every holiday. I joined a book club that was less interested in books than in wine and conversation, and I found this to be entirely satisfactory. As for Donald and Cheryl, I had not sought updates, but news travels in ordinary ways. Donald sold his house in Columbus and moved to a smaller condo in a development outside the city. I heard this from a woman at my gym who had known his second wife and tracked his movements with the interest some people reserve for local real estate. He was, by all accounts, quiet. The settlement had left him with what was fair but not with what he had anticipated, and the gap between those two things is a particular kind of poverty that has nothing to do with money. Cheryl's situation was harder. The civil complaint from Gerald Fitch's estate, combined with scrutiny of the paralegal arrangement she had facilitated, had created complications in her professional life. She had been working in property management, which, given what I now knew about her character, struck me as an almost too obvious irony. And the complaint, while ultimately settled without admission of wrongdoing, had the practical effect of costing her a contract renewal and sending her back to Dayton with a reputation somewhat dented. Her father helped her financially, which was appropriate. She had, after all, helped him. But it was a diminished kind of helping, one man's smaller resources stretched to cover another's missteps. I did not feel satisfaction at their difficulties. I want to say that carefully and honestly. I did not seek their suffering, and I did not celebrate it. What I felt was something simpler, the clean, uncomplicated absence of worry about them. They were no longer my problem. They were simply people whose choices had led them to consequences, which is the most ordinary thing in the world. What I felt instead was present. In my house, in my sunroom, with my cat and my coffee and the oak tree going green outside the window again. I was 72 when this began. I was 73 when it ended. In the year between, I had been tested and had not broken. I had been threatened and had not surrendered. I had been alone in the way you are alone at the beginning of something, and had found, in that aloneness, reserves I hadn't known were there. Not every story about a woman my age is a story about diminishment. Sometimes it's a story about what you find out you're made of when the occasion finally requires it. I found out, and what I found was enough. There is a lesson here that I carry with me, and I'll share it plainly. Protect what is yours, not out of greed, but out of self-respect. At any age, in any season. Know your rights, trust your instincts, and find people who help you see clearly. Don't let fear be used against you. And I'll ask you this. If you were standing in that kitchen, phone in hand, while someone who was supposed to love you stood there waiting to see what you would do, what would you have done? Leave your answer below, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening.